This is Robert Margolacci, the Mindshare Learning Report, and welcome to This Week in Canadian EdTech, special edition of Mindshare TV. I'm honored to have joined me for a Mindshare Learning Moment, one of the presenters at the Canadian EdTech Leadership Summit coming up October 19th and 20th at McGill University. Dr. Adam Dube, who is the Director of EdTech Office at the Faculty of Education at McGill University. His research is in educational games and tech and math cognition. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Dr. Dube.
No, thanks for having me, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with you about EdTech and the case of the state of EdTech right in Canada and the world more broadly.
Well, fascinating times post-pandemic. Much has been learned from the crisis learning that EdTech's had help sustain during this period we went through. And now it's really about redefining and refining learning and what's working, hence the inspiration around driving innovation through evidence-based research being the theme of the summit. Talk to me about what you've seen in terms of the impact that EdTech made during the pandemic and what some of the challenges are now that we're facing.
Yeah, so I think one of the big takeaways for the impact of EdTech during the pandemic is it allowed education to continue. The fact that we were able to do remote learning allowed us to close the physical schoolhouse, and then have classrooms, especially across Canada, work out of people's homes. It was incredibly hard for everyone involved, teachers and parents and children, but it allowed education to actually happen. So I think it's one of the biggest takeaways. And now that we're looking back at this practice, I think, reflecting on it, we're seeing some different lessons of what worked, what didn't work. And one of the things that I see for the elementary, secondary education space and kind of people's reactions to it is that there's been a bunch of research showing that out of the United States that there were a lot of learning losses that happened during this spell. Some of the research is showing that children are 2 years behind where they should be in mathematics and basic literacy. So this is very concerning. Researchers were saying this was going to happen. We've seen this happen with other natural disasters where schools were closed, and it did happen here. And then one of the things that's occurring because of this is people are going, well, why did it happen? And people, first off, are pointing to online education, remote delivery. They're saying for these kids, it's a bad tool, it's ineffective. And so maybe there might be this snapback, this pushback against EdTech at the elementary and secondary level because of this learning loss. But Personally, I think that's going too far. I think there's been decades of research on online learning. It can be very effective if done correctly, if people are trained in how to deliver it, if we have the tools and everything else. But during the pandemic, we were doing emergency delivery, and there's a lot of other factors that are contributing to why learning loss happened. It was still a pandemic, stress, anxiety, everything else coupled with it. It's not just the delivery method of the content that was part of the problem. So it's really complex, but I think we're seeing right now perhaps a little bit of a pushback on technology at the elementary and secondary from the public. And a lot of parents who really didn't like doing Zoom school, right? So there's just this natural pushback against it. And I think we're going to have to work against that reaction. And then I see, at the university level, at the post-secondary level, I see something a little bit different. Here, again, tech allowed universities to keep going and functioning. And a lot of students actually valued being able to learn remotely, and they liked that part of it.
Flexibility.
Many of them miss the flexibility of it, the fact that students could still work jobs, take classes in the evening, work it around their schedule. Students with disabilities or with families were able to engage in classes more on their schedule. So they really liked that. And so for me, right now, what's happening at universities, what I see the discourse, say, my own institution and other ones, it's like, well, what's the path forward? It's like, okay, well, one thing is universities are kind of having discussions. Well, how do we make the case that students should be coming in person to universities? What does being here give someone? And we have to do a lot of work to make sure that we're making the best use of our in-person time through hands-on learning and social pieces.
The social, and then the other thing that we're learning, building community as well, building community of practice, isn't it? Right? I mean, that could be done virtually. I did a master's in EdTech at Pepperdine that we had a great community of practice. It was a hybrid program in 2006. So I've experienced that. I know the power and potential, but it's complex. And and not all professors are embracing it, perhaps.
No, and it takes planning, and it takes, you took a program that was designed around this, right? So now universities have to look at, okay, how do we move forward? How do we actually integrate some online delivery parts into our programs? Where is that appropriate, but still enable community building, the social parts of learning to occur, the hands-on parts where it's needed. And so going forward, what we're seeing at universities is basically going, let's take advantage of the fact that we do have in-person locations to use those better, but then also let's see like what does work with remote instruction or online delivery, and how do we do that well and the best way that we possibly can. And so maybe there's a little bit less of a pushback against it, but it's not like we're suddenly all going online. Instead, it's like, well, let's go forward by saying like, let's do the best of what's in person and what's online. And that's kind of the discourse that's happening.
Well,
yeah.
And I think that's a great opportunity for us to really drill down at the summit with international experts that we have joining you, from Dr. Tracy Burns of the OECD, the chief analyst, who happens to be an undergrad from McGill University. So I think she did her PhD at Northeastern. But you were talking about learning loss. Well, there's another alumni, Phil Cutler, who achieved unicorn status from Paper Learning, who won the Startup Challenge several years ago, our Dragon's Den Education Edition. And in 5 years, he's really filled a void, particularly in the U.S. marketplace, and in providing tutoring to the masses, which has got a lot of traction. But I want to read one of your quotes around apps and the research you're doing and the work that you're doing with Ubisoft, and it's fascinating. But the biggest edtech space is apps and App Store, which I didn't realize the magnitude of these apps in the hundreds of thousands, have no standards for what we can call itself educational. Most apps are garbage. App stores could not do a lot more. Could do a lot more to help consumers. And you wrote a paper on this. Talk to me about the inspiration, and I'm going to share your Ubisoft coverage that you got and your partnership with your PhD students doing research around this.
Yeah, so 100%. So like the message of the tweet was we have a whole series of work that looks at the educational app marketplace. There are, you and I were just talking about like one teacher who had access to 12,000 apps perhaps that they had to choose from. And my lab looks at educational apps in, say, the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. I just double checked, like the most recent citation we have is like there's over 200,000 apps that call themselves educational.
Wow.
And so
that's overwhelming for parents and students and teachers for that matter.
It's completely overwhelming, and there's absolutely no guidance from the app stores themselves as to which ones are better or worse, or even really accurately describing what's in these apps. The app store descriptions, there's no regulations about what people really have to say. There's no guidelines for these types of things. And I talk with individual developers like, well, what should we put here? What would be useful? And then we do research with parents and educators. What do they look for when they're selecting apps? What markers, or what we call benchmarks of quality, do they look for when they're choosing an app from the App Store? So we've done a bunch of research in that space. And one of my biggest things here is that I think that the edtech industry and these platforms need to come together to create standards of quality. They need to somewhat create a regulatory system or a review system that they can all say like, well, this is what's in our app. They can agree with sort of like an MPA rating for motion pictures out of the United States. We need something like that for educational software that gives some guidance to say like, well, what does this software do? How useful is it? How do we know that it's useful? And that would be useful for every good company that's really investing in this space, because they want their products and their efforts to stand out against someone else who's just, not really thinking about the educational part of it and is just trying to enter the market. One of those 200,000.
And Adam, that to your point, that was part of the inspiration we'll be announcing at the summit October 19th to 20th at McGill, in partnership with your #1 university in Canada. How does that make you feel to be part of that? No pressure there.
Yeah, no, it's The number one university always is an interesting metric. It depends on whose metric you're reading on which week.
Yes.
Because I'm an alumni of the University of Toronto, and I get the emails
There
from
you
them
go.
whenever they get the number one spot, and then I get the email the next week from McGill saying, "But we're number
Yeah.
one over here." So it's always it's a fun thing to get. I get all the emails from all the institutions saying we're number one.
Well, the fact of the matter is, you're a top tier university and
Yes, exactly. We're all
well
doing
positioned
great work
with great tradition, and you're doing great work and partnered with Ubisoft. And I pulled up that website and the coverage you got there. Talk to me a little bit about the inspiration for this project. And you were talking about compliancy and interoperability. That was part of the inspiration of the Canadian EdTech Alliance that we're announcing at the summit. We're giving a sneak peek on a couple things that we're going to share, but there needs to be greater collaboration and understanding of the standards and to your point that you made earlier. So over to you and the Ubisoft project.
Yeah, so this project was something that was initiated by Ubisoft. They make a series of educational games called Discovery Tour based on their multi-million selling Assassin's Creed series. Each one of these games, there are 3 distinct games, Ancient Egypt, Ancient Greece, and the Viking Age. And they make these ones that are purely for entertainment, but then they also make an educational version where it's got these in-depth experiences, these realized worlds for each of these different time periods. And these are these excellent tools. And so they've already made these things, but they did notice that teachers wanted help figuring out, well, how do I use this educational game in my classroom? There's this barrier. Maybe a teacher isn't a gamer themselves, but they heard about Discovery Tour, they saw it on the news or their friend talks about it. So, well, how do I use games for learning? How do I use this game? Also, how do I teach what I want to teach? This is what I need to do in my curriculum. I'm supposed to cover these topics. So how do I do that? And so what we did as a group of researchers is we partnered with Ubisoft. We looked at curriculums from across North America, Europe, India, and China. And we said, what are the different learning goals for every grade from kindergarten to grade 12? And we said, okay, for each of these games, we created an interactive teacher guide that says, okay, teacher, what do you teach? You teach mathematics? Well, you can look, you're a math teacher. Here's every single way you could use this game to teach about math. You can actually click on one of the guides for it's the C curriculum guide, and it's this fully interactive thing. And the idea of this is that we want to make it so that great tools are getting into the hands of educators. And so, within these things, what we have is like a curriculum map for all of them. And it's okay, going through all of them, but basically it's a tool so that teachers can take advantage of the educational game and know how to use it. And some of it is like, oh, you want to teach math, you want to teach about triangles, here's where the game can help you do that. Or you can say, well, here's a list of all the things the game teaches, and the teacher can actually go through and pick and choose a bunch of things, and they can print off their own private lesson plan at the end of this. And it's interactive, there's videos, so it's basically a how to use games for learning around the Discovery Tour games.
I could really see how engaging that would be potentially for students if the teacher leverages it properly, and it's about relatability, and that's what kids gravitate to.
Yeah, and the idea here is that, again, you've got a great tech solution in an educational game, but then it's like, okay, how do you get it to the students in the way that they're going to accept it, and it's going to actually teach what the teachers want? And that's a big puzzle with any sort of ed tech solution. It's like, okay, great, we've made this amazing tool, but how do we help teachers use it correctly, use it well? How do we give teachers the leeway so that they can make their own choices? Because all teachers are great at what they do and they want to be flexible. So I think these types of things where you make teacher guides for software, for educational tools, is a real big space that needs to be filled, because you can make the tool, but it's only going to be useful if the teachers know how to use it. So this is one collaboration that we've done. We'll talk more about it, at the summit, and have a kind of a review on. I did this with 2 PhD students, Chu Zhu and Robin Sharma at the Technology Learning and Cognition Lab. This is my lab's website at McGill. The different projects that we do. So those 2 students were the leads on the project with the team at Ubisoft.
How important is it for an ed tech company to have a chief pedagogical officer, if you will?
I personally think it's critical. I've worked with many different ed tech companies. You and I were just chatting, and it's the experience that it's not necessarily the case that they have a chief pedagogical officer. A lot of times they have learning specialists, that are lower, perhaps in the production pipeline, of their software. But I think a company really needs a theory, a philosophy of how they think learning actually occurs, because that philosophy is going to guide the design of their products. If they envision learning, say, for example, as a company, as dialogue between individuals and conversations, well, then as a company, they're going to make a very different group of products than if they view learning as a matter of repeated practice. Both of those things have merit. Practicing does build understanding, but so do conversations. So a chief pedagogical officer, I think, is someone who could actually set a direction for how they believe learning occurs. And this is one of the papers, on how to find good educational apps. But I really think that's key. And I've actually got a student right now, a PhD student, Armagan Montazami, and what she's doing is she's interviewing educational app developers in the process of making educational apps, and basically asking them, like, how do you think learning occurs? What is your personal learning theory? And then she's looking at how does that translate into the experiences that they design. And one of the things that we've seen with educational apps is that people espouse a bunch of really big ideas sometimes when you talk to them, but then you look at their software and it's mostly drill and practice behaviorist approaches for a lot of software that exists, especially in the educational game space. And so that pedagogical officer could be somebody who's checking to make sure, like, well, this is our philosophy of learning, and then here's our tool, and are these actually working? Are we actually meeting what we're saying we're doing? I think that's key. So we're having conversations with developers as part of our research group as well.
Well, Dr. Dube, we don't want to give away your entire presentation, so you've been more than generous with your insights and passion about the impact and potential impact learning technology can have on student success. Any final thoughts to share?
Oh, I think thanks very much for having this. I look forward to the conversations that are going to happen at the summit, and I think that ed tech can be an excellent tool to solve educational problems, just like we've been saying since the 1920s, right, with this idea. But the question really is, like, well, how do we do it well? How do we do it so that all learners benefit and not just some? So to me that's really key.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Thank you so much again for your time, Adam.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was Dr. Adam Dube, Associate Professor, Learning Services, Director of the EdTech Office at the Faculty of Education at McGill University. My name is Robert Merlacci, the MindShare Learning Report. Be sure to check out www.mindsharelearning.com to get your latest issue. And until next time, or before I say my signature close, be sure to join us October 19th and 20th at the 13th Canadian EdTech Leadership Summit in Montreal in partnership with McGill University. And until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and keep the learning curve steep.